For our disability vlog, we analyzed the film Split and its main character Kevin, who was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. We also watched the sequel Glass to learn more about this disorder.
Our goal for this vlog is to explain Kevin's disorder, how the film reflects the models of disabilities we discussed in class, any positives and negatives of the film's portrayal of DID, and the implications the portrayal has on the perspective general viewers hold about DID.
The movie Split has been produced in 2016. It is mainly a psychological and horror film, written, directed, and produced by Mr. Night Shyamalan, and starring James McAvoy, Annie Taylor-Joy, and Betty Buckley. The film talks about Kevin Wandel, a man with a dissociative identity disorder, DID. He had 23 different personalities. He works for Philadelphia Zoo. The reason showed at the movie why he had DID is that his father had abandoned him and left him in a train. His mother had obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. Kevin was abused and terrorized by his mother. The plot comes when Casey, a young girl, decided to go to a birthday party with her friends. When she finished the party, her friend Claire offered her a ride to go back home, along with her father and other friend, Mercy. When Claire's father knocked unconscious in the car, Kevin attempted to kidnap the girls and isolate them in a cell in his underground quarters. Kevin had many personalities, and each personality showed with a different action in the movie. Dr. Karen Fletcher, who has identified 23 distinct personalities of Kevin. In his mind, these personalities sit in a chair in a room, waiting for Barry, the dominant personality, to allow their turn in control. She has also found that Kevin's physiological changes with each personality. The girls tried to escape by taking advantage of some of the personalities. But at the end, the beast took over and killed both the doctor and Casey's friends. While she had somehow caused the real identity of Kevin to take over, letting him fight with his regret and asking her to kill him by his shotgun. Casey is rescued and learns that she was being held at the Philadelphia Zoo, where Kevin had been employee. Kevin's numerous personalities have earned him the nickname The Horde.
To start off, I'm going to talk a little bit about generally what a personality disorder is, how it turns into dissociative identity disorder, and the history, causes, and symptoms all behind it. A personality disorder is a type of mental illness in which you have trouble perceiving and relating to situations and to people, even including yourself. Dissociative identity disorder comes in a breakdown of 3 different clusters, which include Cluster A, which is autocentric disorders, Cluster B, which is a dramatic, emotional, or erratic disorders, and Cluster C, the anxious or fearful disorders. Dissociative identity disorder is defined to be a sickness from which a person is suffering from mental disturbances and becomes dissociated into more than one personality. It arises from continued and repeated physical abuse from the beginning of their early childhood, along with problems in brain functioning. The different personalities that occur are called alters, in which the self-image and identity of the individual, including a separate name as well as age, all come into place. At least 2 of these personalities take control of the person's behavior. Switching of these alters can take seconds to minutes to days. We can describe this whole dynamic as these people feeling like passengers in their own body rather than the driver. For these alters, the identities can resemble the main personality, or they may be a different age, gender, or race of religion. Each personality can have its own set of gestures, hairstyle, way of dressing, or even accent. Going back into time, before the 19th century, people with DID were considered to be possessed, and which ultimately ended the majority of them up imprisoned and treated very poorly. The mental sufferings that happen are sleep apnea, which is a lack of sleep, amnesia, which is a memory loss of the brain when you can't recall information, flashbacks, and identity confusion. The symptoms that occur are a sense of being detached from yourself, a perception of the people and things around you as distorted and unreal, and of course, frequent mood swings. Most people with this illness are diagnosed roughly between the ages of 20 and 40 years old, and the most common treatment for it is long-term psychotherapy or cognitive therapy about twice a week and lasts around 4 years. During this treatment, it's encouraged that the person and his alters communicate with each other in order to integrate or to come together. Overall, there is no medication to treat this disorder. What people often confuse DID with is schizophrenia, which are not the same disorders but can come off to seem very similar. Overall, DID is very rare. Schizophrenia is likely the more well-known of the two mental illnesses, however, it's widely misunderstood. In order to meet the criteria for schizophrenia, an individual must experience delusions and hallucinations, and this is not the case with DID. So, you're probably wondering what happens if this disorder goes on not being treated. If you don't treat this illness, it can lead to suicide attempts, victimization, self-injury, social problems, violence, and substance abuse. Some negative stereotypes associated with this disorder are that people are faking their mental illness, the treatment that they're getting is making the illness worse, and overall people thinking you cannot cure this disorder, which is false. You may have heard in a lot of cases regarding criminals engaging in acts of violence and using DID as their way out of it, or the reason as to why they committed these actions and behaviors. Although there are some heinous crimes that are committed with people that have this disorder, we have to take into account that this illness does alter the way they think and the actions that they make, which all comes back to the idea of these people feeling like passengers instead of the driver in their own body, which means they really do not have full control over what the outcomes are and what to do in these situations. All-inclusive dissociative identity disorder is not always a harmful and dangerous thing. All people can do is understand the symptoms that come along with it, and we can try our best to help them and not stereotype against them at all as bad people.
The moral model has two different parts to it. The first part defines disability as the reflection of a moral failing. The second part defines disability as a character weakness, corruptness, or immoralness. From this model's viewpoint, people with disabilities are treated with cultural repercussions and rituals, or they're simply left out to die. This model leads to stigmas of disabilities, neglect of people with disabilities, and segregation of these individuals. The full blame is on the individual, or the blame can be placed on the failings of this individual's family, potentially saying that because of your failings in life prior to this moment, your karma is that your loved one is going to have a disability. This is your punishment. There is a link between disability and sin within this model. No one wants to associate with a group of people who are abnormal, immoral, and transgressive, which results in people with disabilities being segregated. They are thought of as disposable here. We saw this model incorporated in Split during the scene with Mrs. Fletcher, Kevin's therapist, talking with her neighbor after one of her sessions with one of Kevin's identities, Barry. Mrs. Fletcher mentions how we, as in the people of society, tend to think of these people as less than. Mrs. Fletcher lashes back, explaining that we should instead think of these people as more than. She also labels them as extraordinary, which is an example of the second part of the moral model. This too is another example. Mrs. Fletcher believes people like Kevin are the reason why the idea of superpowers and superhumans exist. She holds people with dissociative identity disorder as being immoral and more than just a human being. In Glass, the characters with this disability were killed off at the end as an attempt to keep them hidden from the world. The medical model is the belief that all human issues can be fixed. A person with a disability is a person with a biological dysfunction that can and should be fixed to meet our perfect world. Although the problem is the individual in this model, he or she is thought of as irrelevant because it all lies on the physician, physical or occupational therapist, etc., and what they deem a solution for this quote-unquote problem. In Split, one of Kevin's identities, Jade, explains how doctors say that they, Kevin and his identities, are all the same one person portraying different personalities. But Jade has diabetes and needs insulin shots, and none of the other identities do. The doctors here are disregarding the patient and focusing only on what they deem is a reason, problem, and solution. In Glass, a corrective procedure was going to be performed on the part of Elijah's frontal lobe that was overstimulated to try to fix him. This was done without his consent. He was woken up from his sleep, ushered into the surgery room, and sedated. Elijah was ordered to be heavily sedated throughout his time at the psychiatric research hospital anyway, which is yet another example of doctors trying to take control of the situation. The personal tragedy model defines disability as just that, a tragedy. People with disabilities need to be taken care of. They need a hero. People with disabilities are often labeled as inspirational, and more often than not, they're given this label and congratulated for doing things of no significance, like simply getting out of bed in the morning or just living in general. Phrases like he or she is suffering from is one that is often used when talking about someone with a disability, but how do we know that he or she is actually suffering? Although not very present in either films, Kevin portrays this model towards the end of Split when he asks Casey to kill him. The way he is living now is too much of a burden for him and for others. He feels bad for himself for having to always fight for the light and also knows that he's doing bad things in the world that he has no control over because of the other identities. Here, Casey would be his hero. The social model was the most prevalent model used throughout both movies. The disabled community is thought of as the largest minority group in the United States. This model focuses on how society discriminates and limits civil rights advocacy and disability awareness for people with disabilities. In contrast to the models already discussed, the social model puts a central focus on society and the environment that limits the opportunity and access for people with disabilities. It includes both physical and attitudinal barriers. There were several examples in Split that portrayed society's ignorance about DID. Some of these include when Barry was in one of his sessions with Mrs. Fletcher talking about when she's finally done with this profession, they're going to need people to care for them, but nobody even knows that they exist. People are simply uneducated. It's the idea that if we don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist. Barry asked Mrs. Fletcher, does anybody care about us because he feels he is alone and separated from the rest of society? People with DID are labeled as hard to understand, or often misunderstood, again to the lack of understanding, advocating, and awareness. In Glass, the idea that we are trying to make sense of who they are is a recurring thing. The characters exhibiting this disability too question themselves because of society, forcing the idea on them that they just don't belong. Elijah states, to be so different, you don't know where you fit, and mentions, they almost convinced me I was crazy. Both statements support the idea that society plants these ideas in their heads. We plant this belief that people with DID are in fact crazy and disturbed, and even dangerous sometimes. We feel afraid of them and what they may do to us. We're not crazy, says Hedwig, yet another identity of Kevin's, trying to deviate from the stigma of DID that society has created and embedded in our minds.
We, as a society, always seem to be interested in movies about mental disorders. Psycho and Fight Club are examples of movies that have done really well because they were based on mental disorders. But it seems like we are fascinated with these movies and about these disorders not because we are empathetic towards the characters, but because we are interested in the disorder because we want to be entertained by the movie. I remember with Split, it came out when I was in high school, and I saw it in the movie theaters as soon as it came out. And it wasn't because I wanted to learn more about the disorder so I could help those people. It was more about this looked like an interesting movie and was something that would be entertaining. So, and at that age, I had heard about people who had multiple personalities, but I really wasn't aware that this was an actual mental disorder that's in the DSM-5, and there have been cases all around the world. A lot of people say that DID isn't a real mental disorder, and it's something that the people make up, and it's only found in people who live in America. But there have been a lot of cases in Asia as well that have been found. So I'm a psychology major, so I've taken classes on abnormal psychology and mental disorders. And after I realized about all the trauma and abuse that these people went through that caused this disorder, I realized how harmful a movie like Split is to the community of people living with this disorder. The biggest problem in the movie Split is that it portrays people with DID as being violent or dangerous. Kevin, who is the real name of the man with the multiple personalities, is very violent in a few of his identities, and obviously the entire movie revolves around him kidnapping and killing teenage girls. And in one of his identities, Kevin actually identifies not as a human anymore. He identifies as a beast who is much stronger and more powerful than his other identities. And this is a part of the movie, especially that got a lot of criticism for, because his actual body was changing when he turned into the beast. And some people do, when they transition from an identity to the other identity, they may have a different posture, a different look on their face, but it's not really something as drastic as it was portrayed in the movie. So when Kevin turns into the beast in the movie, he looks a lot larger and more muscular than he was with his other identities, and his veins pop out on his body, and his pupils are dilated in a way, so the only part of his eyes that you can see is black. And when Kevin is the beast, he's very athletic. He's able to climb on walls. He runs on all fours, and he's able to jump on top of trains. And then there has been cases with people who have DID in real life where one identity may be more athletically inclined than the other identity, but in the movie, Kevin was doing things that no human would ever be able to do, no matter which identity he was in. And there's a part in the movie where he actually opens up a metal cage with his bare hands, and there's a scene towards the end of the movie where he kills his therapist by putting his arms around her and squeezing her until her spine breaks, which is obviously something that most people are not able to do with their own abilities. And then, at the worst of it all, the beast eats other human beings. That's what he feeds off of, which is obviously not something that would really ever happen in real life, even with a person who doesn't have this mental disorder. And then, so most people are aware that this movie is fiction and that a person with a DID is not like this in real life. It's still, however, whether it's conscious or unconscious, it still places in our mind that people with DID are dangerous. And the movie was rated PG-13, which means a good portion of the audience was older children. And many people, especially the people who are young and saw the movie, are not aware that this is a real mental disorder. And so now all of their knowledge of this disorder is from the movie that's giving inaccurate information to its audience. And there are also maybe younger people who have DID or who are just diagnosed with DID, and movies like Split causes individuals to feel like they have to hide their disorder, or else if they tell someone, they might think like, oh, I can't talk to you because you're dangerous. We can't be friends with you because you can't be trusted. And then after Split came out in theaters, I read an article online, and it was saying people who actually have DID after watching the movie were now more ashamed and embarrassed of their mental disorder, and didn't want to tell anyone anymore that they had this disorder just because of the way it was portrayed in the movie. So I think it's important to remember that individuals with DID came from a childhood that was filled with extreme trauma and abuse that could not be imagined by most people. And the people with this mental disorder are not evil or dangerous. They were just pushed beyond their mental limits at a very young age, to the point where they develop a coping mechanism. And it may be helpful for those of us who do not have DID to view those people as being courageous and brave just because they were able to survive the worst possible conditions and their brain changed and allowed them to develop a way to deal with this disorder in a way that some people are not. And as we said a lot of times in class, just because a person is doing something in a different way, just because these people are coping in a different way, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing or that person is bad.
Although this movie definitely portrayed DID in a negative light, I feel there were actually some positives to it. The one positive that stood out for me was showcasing what can cause DID. It is not typically common knowledge that DID is a result of childhood trauma. This helps further explain why it is a disability. People who have DID do not choose it. It is a result of something awful happening to them, and their mind tries to create a safe place for them. For Kevin, his mother was physically abusive. It did not show if she was also emotionally abusive, but it can be assumed. Instead of fearing an individual with DID, we need to take more steps to understand what they are going through. I also appreciated that they emphasized how important therapy is to a person with this disability. The therapist was not trying to change him. She was giving him the tools he needed in order to function. She really cared about Kevin and got to know all his alters very well. She never made him feel as though he was crazy, which is what most people think of people with DID. It also showed that he was able to maintain a job. I feel one of the largest stereotypes with people with disabilities is people wondering how they work. If given the tools they need to succeed, they can do anything. Most individuals with DID lead typical lives. They were really accurate in their portrayal of the host, Kevin, and his alters. The host has no recollection of what his alters have done, as well as no control. The alters take over when a situation is stressful, and that is how his mind tries to keep him safe from future trauma. Some of his alters showed his more compassionate side, and that he was not, in fact, a monster. They also accurately portrayed that the alters can be different ages, genders, races, have many different personalities, and even different sexualities. Some alters can be left-handed or right-handed. They can have different athletic or artistic abilities. One of the alters was Hedwig, a 9-year-old boy. He was very fun-loving and innocent, but also under the control of some of the more aggressive alters. Another was a woman named Patricia. She was older and she had an accent. She had a completely different posture than the other alters, so just by how she was standing, you knew when Patricia was the alter you were being presented with. I also watched Glass, that dealt more in detail with Kevin, but also dealt with Elijah, who has an extreme case of brittle bone syndrome. This is a very rare condition, but I feel like it was portrayed very well. Elijah needed to utilize a wheelchair. He also needed to be careful not to fall or hurt himself, or his bones would break. It showed the reality of what it must have been like to be a child with this disability. Elijah was at a carnival and wanted to ride the tilt-a-whirl like the other children. Due to being on this ride, he broke multiple bones. I'm glad they showed how he just wanted to have fun and he was deprived of it. It also showed how worried his mother was about him even though he was an adult. This is common in families that have children with a disability. The parents feel they need to be the caregiver even if their child is capable of caring for themselves. It was good they showed this to also shed some light on that topic. So overall, I feel like there were not many positives in the movie, but I feel like they really did a good job of portraying both the disabilities in both films.
The entertainment we choose to watch has a big impact on how we view the world and make sense of it. This can be a great thing because you can learn a lot about different topics, but with movies that focus on different mental illnesses and disabilities that are already surrounded in stigma, they can do a lot to either reinforce what you already thought you knew or completely change your opinion. While watching Split, I did a lot of thinking about how this movie's portrayal of DID could influence the viewers watching it. As Toya and Grace both explained, the movie's portrayal of DID had a lot of positives and negatives, and for people who are familiar with DID, they have some idea about what was accurate and what was just movie magic to make the movie more thrilling and engaging. However, for people who aren't as familiar with the disorder, they may take it all for fact. For example, Split's entire plot is based on a man with multiple identities abducting a group of girls and holding them hostage. For somebody who is not familiar with DID, they could take this piece of the movie and generalize it to any person with DID or even any mental illness and expect them to be more likely to commit violent or serious crimes, where in reality, people with mental illness and other disabilities are more likely to be the victim of the crime rather than the perpetrator. Another inaccuracy in the portrayal of DID that goes along with this idea that people with mental illnesses are a danger to society and that viewers may take too seriously is when Kevin transforms into his most violent identity, the Beast. When Kevin transforms into his identity, his physique changes and he becomes bigger, stronger, and more violent. He is also able to climb walls and run on all floors like an animal. As Grace said earlier, people with DID may have other non-human identities, but that does not mean their overall body goes through visible changes. For people who aren't familiar with DID, they may believe that all people with the disorder have some type of identity that completely changes their bodies and abilities and makes them a bigger danger to society. Though Split can definitely have a negative impact on how viewers see DID, it does provide opportunities for education for the public. DID is a very rare disorder, so most people will never experience it firsthand. If a person had never heard of DID prior to watching Split, they might be more likely to try and learn about it, even with a simple Google search for the disorder. This curiosity could lead people to learning about and maybe even eventually advocating for people with a disability. As Toya explained already, this movie shows how important it is for a person with DID to seek therapy and potentially medication to help manage it. I think the scenes that involved Kevin in therapy and his dynamics with his therapist show how everyone should treat a person with DID. Kevin's therapist doesn't treat him like a crazy or violent person. She's also not afraid of Kevin's other identities, but I've taken the time to understand them and how they relate to the trauma Kevin experienced in his childhood that may have been a trigger to his development of DID. Hopefully people that watch this movie take this into account and use it to help understand the best ways to interact and understand any person with a disability, not just DID. Viewers could learn to try and understand the disorder or disability when they don't understand, to ask the appropriate questions to gain insight, and learn before clinging to an already existing stigma. The movie Split definitely has an impact on the people who choose to watch the movie. However, whether that impact is positive or negative depends on what the viewer takes away from the movie. If they are frightened by Kevin and not willing to understand what DID really is, then they will continue to embrace the stigma that people with mental illnesses are a danger to society. On the other hand, viewers who develop interest in DID after seeing the movie could take the opportunity to learn more about the disorder and educate themselves about how to interact with not only people with DID, but any person with a mental illness or disability.
To sum all of the things up, firstly we discussed and talked about the disability itself, and then we have talked about the different models shown at the movie. As a moral model, we have said that it has two parts. And the first part defines the disability as the reflection of a moral failing. And the second part defines disability as a character weakness. Additionally, we have noticed that the medical moral represented in the movie is that the BWDs are people with biological issues and can be fixed to make them perfect. There was also the personal tragedy model and the social model. We have also discussed about the negatives and the positives of the movie. In the negatives, we said that portraying people with DID as dangerous is the biggest problem with the movie. Also, we argued that DID does not mean a change in the physical appearance as it was shown at the movie. Furthermore, the movie will affect those who are diagnosed with DID already, causing them to think that it's a shame and they need to hide. However, there was some positives that we have figured throughout the movie, such as the importance of the therapy is to a person with this disability. In addition, the movie had explained clearly that DID is not an inborn disability, and it is not a circumstance of certain action, but it is caused by some awful things that it is not in the person's hand. This discussion was summed up by talking about the implications of the movie.